the Fairy Queen, Spencer emphasizes the importance of performing one's duty and accepting responsibility to complete the quest. Several heroic figures emerge during the course of the poem, and each is given a question to undertake, a monster or demon to extinguish. So for the next author, balik po. Yan. Si William Tyndale. So William Tyndale believed that all people should have access to Bible in their own language. Hindi niya nakumpleto yung Bible kasi namatay siya. Pero he did translate the Pentateuch, and William Tyndale is considered the most important Bible translator in history. So despite the fact that Tyndale never finished his Bible before his death, yung nag-translate naman is si Miles Coverdale. Nintranslate niya yung remaining content ng Bible, kaya natapos yung full English Bible ni William Tyndale. Si Tyndale namatay siya, kaya ayun, he was bound to a stake and allegedly cried before being strangled and his lifeless body being burned. So for the last author naman, si Sir Thomas More. Next page. Ayan. Si Thomas More, sinulat na yung novel na Utopia, which refers to a perfect political system. In Utopia, there is no greed, corruption, or power struggles. There is very little hierarchy, and everything is held in common. So at its heart, the book poses the question of whether there could be such thing as a perfect world, and served as a platform to highlight the chaos of European politics that time. So, the book na Utopia, di ba, it was written in 1516. It is More's attempt to suggest ways to improve the European society using Utopia as an example. So, More was a major figure of the English Renaissance who cared deeply about the moral and political responsibilities of the individuals. So now, before we resume on to the next reporter, we would like to start the report with 3 questions posed by Sir Peter, and those are: number 1, what is Michel Fontaine's philosophy? Number 2, what is his famous essay? And the last one, what is Michel Fontaine known for? Miss Galang, the floor is all yours.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Andre Isabel Galang. So, continuation lang to. Montaigne's philosophy is he believed that our powers of reason could afford us a happiness and greatness denied to other creatures. What were the main ideas of Montaigne? Montaigne applies and illustrates his ideas concerning the independence and freedom of the self, and the importance of social and intellectual intercourse in all his writings. And in particular in his essay nga, di ba siya yung founder ng essay. How does Montaigne recommend life? Learning to live in the end is learning to live with imperfection, sabi nga niya. Montaigne put his best in himself. Our being is cemented with stickly qualities. Whoever should remove the seeds of these qualities from man would destroy the fundamental conditions of our lives. What is famous essay? His philosophical skepticism is best expressed in the long essay, An Apology for Raymond Sebond. Ang sinasabi dito sa An Apology for Raymond Sebond is, man has no knowledge to speak of outside of the divine, as we have not been equipped to judge the world around us. Next po, sa Julius excluded in heaven. Wait lang po. So, Julius excluded in heaven. Um, ang writer dito ay si Eramus. He was born October 27, 1466. Or October 27, 1469. Medyo hindi kami sure if ano yung totoong birth date niya, no? So, yung Julius excluded in heaven, Eramus saw that the Roman Catholic Church of his time needed to reform. However, he was not willing to go as far or did not see the need to go as far as Martin Luther. So he writes this satire the year of Pope Julius II dies. Julius II, that so-called warrior pope, dies and goes to St. Peter's Gate. However, St. Peter won't let him into heaven. From that, they had some debates nga. So Julius trying to conceive Peter to let him in by listing his achievements, pero hindi talaga achievements yon, mga corruption nung time na yon, yung nasa story nga. And Pope Peter refusing to grant him passage, horrified to learn the state of papacy. Anyways, with this written piece of Eramus does a good job of characterizing the papacy by contrasting its corruptions against Peter and his philosophy. Eramus Julius is obviously a caricature, but he is an effective symbol of everything wrong with 15th and 16th century papacy. So si Eramus, he embraced the humanistic belief in an individual capacity for self-improvement and the fundamental role of education in raising human beings above the level of brute animals. The thrust of Eramus' educational program was the promotion of docta pietas, learned piety, or what he termed the philosophy of Christ. The next reporter po, Marilyn Gadi.
Good afternoon po. Am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you po. So let's proceed to the impact of Reformation on literature. The Reformation was a great 16th century religious revolution in the Christian Church which had a notable literary effect. The impact of Reformation was deeply felt in the literature of the 16th century, and the Reformation put an end to the medieval tradition of anonymous authorship. So now, as we all know by this time, Reformation means the movement for bringing about reforms in the Christian Church. Reformation is the child of Renaissance, and a 16th century European movement aimed to change the beliefs and practices of the Catholic Church. 16th century religious revolution, which means it was changed or did away with some Catholic teachings that created Protestant churches. And it was started by a monk named Martin Luther, which was discussed by Hannah. So, how did the Reformation affect literature? Because of the Reformation poems, novels, all types of literature suffered persecution. Stephen Gazan published The School of Abuses, which attacked poetry. He wrote that poetry to encourage frivolous imagination, and its metaphorical nature bordered around deceit and that it should not be allowed in the reformed countries. Others had different views on poetry, like Sir Philip Sidney. He argued with Gazan claims saying that poetry had the ability to transform and it did not affect all people. Novels were viewed as a waste of time since they were fiction and it had nothing to do with God. The theater was associated with drunkenness, cursing, gambling, immorality, and most stage players were viewed as sinful. So next slide. Next slide po. Reformation, like the Renaissance, produced a new kind of thinking in the mind of the people, and the reflection of it could be seen in the literature produced after it. So the influence of it is more profoundly seen in the literature of that period. All the all the forms of literature were grown during this age of Reformation, and therefore England known as the nest of singing birds. So in this, Sidney, Spencer, and Bacon were the great supporters of this period, the Reformation. Chaucer was the first great poet who discarded the clergyman and exposed their evil deeds in his Canterbury Tales, while Marlowe's Doctor Faustus reveals true Reformation spirit. And then Bacon expressed Reformation in his prose because Francis Bacon is considered one of the fathers of modern science. So next slide. So these are the conclusions in the Reformation period. The 16th century holds an important place in the history of England. There were two revolutions during this period that has changed the face of European history: the Renaissance and the Reformation, which prepared the background for the emergence of the modern period. Reformation ended with the separation of many European nations from the Church of Rome and became the basis for the founding Protestantism. Next slide. Next slide po. And then in short, Reformation was the start of intellectual progress. It awoke sleeping man and filled the minds with pure Christianity. It abolished the corruption of the clerics, and also the political powers were given the House of Commons. Next slide. And before I end our report, I would like to share this quote of George Gillespie: Reformation ends not in contemplation, but in action. Thank you po. That's all po.
Okay, congratulations, Group 6. So is this the last group to report or not?
May another group pa po.
Okay, so may I know the next reporters?
Yes po, Ash.
Okay, you may now have the floor.
Okay po. Ash. Asuyo po. Thank you. Yan. Thank you po. So, again, we are Group 1. Baka po nagtataka kayo, but Group 1 na naman. Last report po kasi namin, it's just an overview po about the literary movements and literary periods po. We have already talked about The four literary early periods, which are the classical, medieval, Renaissance, and the period of Reformation. And we have also talked about the literary movements po, di ba, like Romanticism, Naturalism, Realism, and Modernism. And for today po, we will talk about the seven other literary movements, which are the metaphysical, symbolism, Harlem Renaissance, the Beats, confessional, the New York School, and the Black Arts movement. So let's start pa with the metaphysical. So next slide. Sige po, next po. Ayan. Anyone? Po na gustong magbasa? Or ako na lang po para po mabilis. Ay, may nag-raise. Sige po, Miss Maricar Manyo. Yung dalawang bullet.
Metaphysical is a philosophical concept used in literature to describe the things that are beyond the description of physical existence. And metaphysics is about exploration and philosophy, not about science and math.
Ayun, thank you po. So, from the highlighted word, di ba, nakikita po natin, it's beyond the description of the physical existence. Because from the combination words po, from Greek prefix meta, which means after or beyond, added with the word physical, the word metaphysical or after physical or beyond physical refers to something that cannot be explained by science. Kasi more on exploration po siya at saka philosophy. It questions the nature of reality po in a philosophical way. For example, what are the metaphysical thoughts or metaphysical questions during this movement? Noon po, they question if God exists. Since science or math cannot explain po yung question na yun, lalo na po sa mga unbelievers during those time po. Tapos there are also questions like, is there a difference between the way things appear to us and the way they really are? For example, ito bang nasa harapan natin ay PowerPoint presentation or it's just a PowerPoint presentation kasi yun ang sinabi sa atin ng mundo? Ganun po yung mga question and topic noong metaphysical literary movement. And what is the difference between reality and perception? Totoo ba yung nakikita natin sa harapan natin? Ganun. Is everything that happened already predetermined? Kung yung pong nangyayari ngayon is malalim po ang metaphysical, di ba? Napapaisip tayo. Ganun yung mga topics niya. It's beyond the physical existence po kasi. Is everything that happened already predetermined? Kung, di ba sabi po nila, yung mga nangyayari storya ng buhay natin. If so, then is free choice non-existent? Di ba? Napapaisip po ba kayo? Ganyan po ang metaphysical literary movement. And may question pa na, is consciousness limited to the brain? Eh ano yung naiisip natin kapag nananaginip tayo? Ganyan po ang metaphysical literary movement. Now, it is intended to explain the fundamental nature of being in the world using the intellect and emotions of the individual. And it makes audience think about the things they had never imagined po. May broad, hindi naman po medyo, broad talaga yung topic sa metaphysical since ginagamitan po siya ng imagination, no? Ang daming questions sa mundo, ganun. And they fall under metaphysical. Lalo na po yung hindi po na-explain ng siyensya, ng matematika. Next slide po. Ayan. Who would like to read? As po, Miss Heidi.
Metaphysical poetry is a highly intellectualized poetry marked by bold and ingenious conceits, incongruous imagery, complexity, and subtle of thought, frequent use of paradox, and often by deliberate harshness or rigidity of expression.
Ayun po. Thank you po. So, doon pa lang po sa explanation, di ba, nakikita na natin na ang complicated po ng pagsusulat ng metaphysical poetry. First, it uses for bold and ingenious conceits kung saan it's often unconventional po and logically complex yung mga topic nila. Pero doon po nila nakukuha yung attention kasi ng tao. Tapos they use strange or parang out of place na figurative language. Tapos, ayun po, sabi complex pero subtle. Diba? Ang gulo. Ganyan po ka-complicated ang paggawa po at pagsulat ng metaphysical poetry. Tapos po, there is a frequent use of paradox, yung pong contradictory, di ba? And often deliberate harshness po and rigidity of expression. So, ano po ba yung mga features ng metaphysical poetry? Next po. Ayan. First is the wit and serious questions. Metaphysical texts are based on wit and often deal with serious questions. Tulad po ng sinabi ko, ginagamitan, kasi highly intellectualized talaga ang pagsusulat ng metaphysical poetry. Ginagamitan talaga siya ng wit. And usually yung mga serious questions under sa metaphysical poetry is yung questions nga about the existence of God and the tendency of human beings to perceive this world. Tapos po, there is also a touch of humor in metaphysical poetry because it's in the sense po, it makes the seriousness a bit light in intensity. Kaya hinahaluan po nila ng humor. And ito nga po, it questions the unquestionable. It elevates the readers of their normal existence to make them question things, yung mga unquestionable things po. And yun, there is also a comparison of unlikely things na dahil nga po it is characterized by wit, sometimes they connect unconnected ideas. Ganun po yung metaphysical poetry, comparison of unlikely things. Tapos, ayun po, ipapaisipin niya talaga yung mga readers niya. The readers are forced to think through the argument inside the poem po. Next po. Ayan, conceit, paradox, and irony. Yun nga po, tulad ng sinabi ko, parang same sila nung it questioned and questionable and the comparison of the unlikely since contradictory nga po yung mga nakasulat. And gumagamit po ng different approaches sa metaphysical poetry such as argumentative, intellectual, realistic, and rational. So, pag-usapan naman po natin yung mga famous metaphysical poets. Next po. Ayan. Ayan. Sino pong gustong magbasa ng mga mahihirap na pangalan na to? Yes po. Miss Annalyn Manyo.
So, metaphysical poets. Metaphysical poets or poets in 17th century England who inclined to the personal and intellectual complexity and concentration that is displayed in the poetry of John Donne. Others include Henry Vaughan, Andrew Marvell, John Cleveland, and Abraham Cowley, as well as, to a lesser extent, George Herbert and Richard Crashaw. Yun.
Thank you po. Thank you po. Di ba, medyo mahirap po bigkasin yung names nila. Pero mag-focus po tayo sa kay Mr. John Donne and Samuel Johnson because they are the most famous po na individual under metaphysical poetry. Next po. Ayan. We are somehow familiar na po with John Donne, di ba? Since we discussed him po sa scene, right? So, John Donne is known as the father of metaphysical poetry. The English writer and Anglican cleric is considered now to be the preeminent metaphysical poet of his time. He was born in 1572 to Roman Catholic parents, and nung pong pinanganak siya, that was the time na pag po pinapractice yung religion, hinuhuli po sila kasi that is considered illegal po noon. Kaya po yung work ni John Donne, it is distinguished by its emotional and sonic intensity po that plums the paradoxes of faith, human and divine love, and the possibility of salvation related po sa religion. And ayun po, tulad ng sinabi ko kanina na characteristics ng metaphysical poetry, John Donne often employs conceits or extended metaphors to yoke together heterogeneous ideas or yung magkasalungat nga pong idea. And
ayun po, kilala si John Donne as a great English poet and one of the greatest writers of English prose. Ang famous work niya po na pinag-aralan natin is yung Holy Sonnet, right? That Be Not Proud. So, doon pa lang po, alam na natin na yung topic po dun is about death. And, di ba, kine-question ang death kung after that ba anong mangyayari sa tao. Ayan. So, yung mga question po na to, mga thoughts na to, they fall under metaphysical literary movement. Next po si Samuel Johnson. Ayan. Samuel Johnson is the one who coined the term metaphysical poetry. Ayan. Funny thing lang po, nung sinesearch ko to, ang metaphysical poetry po pala, hindi siya kinoconsidered as genre of poetry. In fact, yung pong mga poets or yung mga writer ng metaphysical poetry, they didn't even read each other's work. At hindi po sila na-inform na ang tawag po pala dun sa gawa nila is metaphysical poetry. Diba? And ayun po, si Samuel Johnson, which is a poet, a lexicographer, a translator, a journalist, an essayist, a travel writer, a biographer, an editor, and a critic, is the one who coined the term metaphysical poetry in his book po na Lives of the Most Eminent English Poets. Ayan, diyan po nag-start yung term na metaphysical poetry. And sinulat niya po sa book niya, yung about nga po sa group of poets in the 17th century, included po sila John Donne, and yung mga mahihirap pong name kanina, George Herbert, Richard Crashaw, gano'n. And he wrote poetry po throughout his life from the time he was a schoolboy until 8 days before his death. Ganun po siya talagang inclined sa pagsusulat po ng poetry. And he is usually composing in Latin, Greek, and English po. And according po sa biographer ni Samuel Johnson, dinefine niya po si Johnson as someone who is full of imagery, na he might have been perpetually a poet. And ayun po, any question po with regards to metaphysical literary movement? Malinaw naman po.
Wala po.
Thank you po.
Yes po.
Thank you po. Punta na po tayo sa symbolism. Ayan. Symbolism po is somehow parang related sila ni metaphysical. Ayan. Anyone who would like to read po? Ayan, Miss Kit Trisha.
Symbolism is a loosely organized literary and artistic movement that originated with a group of French poets in the late 19th century.
Pati po yung second bullet. Thank you po.
Sorry. Symbolism is the emphasis on emotions, feelings, ideas, and subjectivity rather than realism.
Thank you po. So, yung symbolism po, nung sinerch ko siya, it started po with the spread in painting and theater po before siya sa literary talaga or sa literature, diba? And it sought to express individual emotional experience po through suggestive use of highly symbolized language. And ang goal po kasi niya nitong symbolism is through symbols, kaya po symbolism, may emphasize po yung meaning behind forms, lines, shapes, colors, words, ganun po. And kaya po nasabi natin kanina na parang same sila ng metaphysical kasi po meron din pong paniniwala, excuse me po, may paniniwala din po si symbolism na there is, after po ng physical world, lay a spiritual reality. May ganun din po siyang paniniwala si symbolism. Sabi po dito, diba, symbolism is the emphasis on emotions, feelings, ideas, and subjectivity rather than realism. Diba po, kung natatandaan niyo pa, ang realism from the word itself, real, diba? There is no embellishment or fantastical plots po sa realism, which is kabaliktaran po ng symbolism since gumagamit dito ng emotion, feelings, ideas, and subjective po siya. Okay, next po.
Ayan. Anyone? Sino pong gustong magbasa? Ayan, Miss Daniel.
Symbolism combined religious mysticism, the perverse, the erotic, and the decadent. Symbolist subject matter is typically characterized by an interest in the occult, the morbid, the dream world, melancholy, evil, and death.
Thank you po. So, ayun, sa binasa po ni Miss Daniel, meron na po tayong idea kung bakit ang symbolism is parang same sila ng metaphysical. Because there is a religious mysticism. Ito po yung Christian tradition po involving the union with God. Tapos in the perverse, mga unacceptable and unreasonable behaviors, erotic, yung pong arousing sexual desires or love, decadent, yung moral and cultural decline. Ganyan po yung mga topic ng symbolism, medyo dark, medyo mabibigat din, complicated din. Tapos po, there is also an interest in the occult or yung supernatural, mystical or magical beliefs, practices, or phenomena. Yung morbid, which is yung about po sa death, ganun, the diseases, diba? Dream world, melancholy, yung sadness, pwede pong under dyan yung depression, and evil and death. Yan po yung usually topic or sinusulat po during symbolism literary movement. Ayun po. Based din po sa na-search ko, ang symbolism po, it provided a transition from romanticism. Ang romanticism po, diba, ito yung it focuses on the emotions and the inner life of the writer. Tapos po, from, ayun, transition po ng romanticism to modernism. Ang modernism naman po, from the word modern, it is modern pa, char, expressing themselves po yung mga writer in more experimental ways in a modern way po, ganun. Tapos po, pag-uusapan naman po natin yung mga symbolist poets. Ayan, may chika po ako dito. Pagdating sa ating mga symbolist poets. Ayan pa. Sino pong gustong magbasa ng mga pangalan na to? Ayan. Ginasa nyo mahirap.
Try natin.
Sige po.
Try natin. Ako pa talaga nagpresenta ako
Sige
yung
po.
pinili. The principal symbolist poets include the Frenchman Stéphane Mallarmé, Paul Verlaine, Arthur Rimbaud, Jules Lafleur, Henry de Reynier, René Hill, and Gustave Kahn. The Belgians Emile Verhaeren and George Rodenbach. The Greek-born Jean Moria and the Americans Francis 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 V. Griffin and Stuart Merrill.
Thank you po. Ayun, thank you po. Appreciate naman po natin si Ash. Pagbabasa po ng mahirap na pangalan. Ayun po. Pero ang focus lang po natin are the three person po or people who were the founders of the symbolist movement, which are Stéphane Mallarmé, Paul Verlaine, and Arthur Rimbaud. Sige po, next. Ayan. Stéphane po is one of the founder of the symbolist movement and a major influence po on 19th and 20th century poetry. He was born on March 18, 1842 in Paris, France. And brief history ng buhay niya. At age 5 po, namatay na po yung mother niya. And then at age 21 naman po, yung father niya and yung sister niya. So, yung pong mga early experiences niya about death, yun po yung reason niya kung bakit magsusulat po siya ng mga literary works and ng mga poetry about death. since di ba po, yun po yung mga topic under symbolism movement. And he made his living as a teacher, an editor, and a translator while working po on his poetry. And yung major work po niya is The Afternoon of a Faun. Kung gusto niyo po siyang basahin, pwede niyo po siyang basahin. Hindi ko na po in-include kasi masyado nang mahaba ang ating report. Tapos po, in-explore po ni Mallarm yung relationship between everyday reality and an ideal world of perfection and beauty that transcends reality. Grabe, di ba? Naniniwala si Mallarme, na there is something more beautiful pa daw po that transcends reality. And din yung imagination ng tao. Right? Pag minsan po mas parang gusto pa natin yung imagination natin kaysa sa reality since mas maganda nga po yun, di ba? And ayun po, one of the founder po si Stefan Mallarme. Next is Paul Verlaine. Next po. Yan, may chika tayo kay Paul Verlaine. Paul Verlaine was also one of the principal founder po ng Symbolist movement. He was born on March 30, 1844 in Metz, France. And he is associated po with many literary works po, pero nag-focus tayo sa poetry niya. Tapos po, itong chika. Ay, gusto niyo po ba ng chika habang nagre-report? Ay, ayaw niyo. Sana po hindi niyo tinuturukan. May chika ako. Ang chika po natin.
Chika.
Ayan, mga chismosa tayo. Maganda naman pag-chismosa natin about sa inspiration ng mga authors kung bakit sila nagsulat. Ayan, ang history po ni story pala. History ako ng history, guys. Story po ni Paul Verlaine is that in 1874, he was married. May wife po siya. But then, it was disrupted by the arrival of Rimbaud. Tapos po, nagkaroon po sila ng ano ba yun? Chikan-chikan, no? Nagkaroon po sila ng passionate and tumultuous love affair. Hala! Ayan. And then, yun po, oo. Iniwan niya po yung wife niya para sumama kay Rimbaud. And the reason naman po doon, para makapagsulat na po siya ng poetry. Yun po ang reason niya, para may inspiration po siya, diba? Since inclined siya sa pagsusulat. And nakita niya na mas matutulungan siya nitong si Rimbaud. Kaya po iniwan niya yung asawa niya. Ayun. Ayun po ang ating chika. Pero ayun po, dahil po doon, ay hindi po dahil dun sa hindi po dahil dun sa nangyaring affair, pero dahil po sa pagsusulat niya, Paul Verlaine is considered as one of the major French poet po ng 19th century and one of the founders nga ng Symbolist movement. Ang active niya pag chika. Ayan po. Ayan, next naman po natin ang kanyang ka-affair. Ayan. Si Arthur. Ayan po. Sana po nag-enjoy kayong makinig, no? May mga chika eh. Arthur Rimbaud was also a founding poet po ng Symbolist movement. Opo, pogi siya, di ba? And Rimbaud was born on October 20, 1854 in Charleville, France. And yan po, devoted din po sa pagsusulat sa poetry, itong si Arthur. Guys, mag-focus kayo dun sa poetry nila, hindi sa itsura. Ano rin po, devoted po sa pagsusulat ng poetry itong si Arthur Rimbaud. And yun nga po, noon po kasi, he ran away from home. Ayan, naglakwat siya. Charot. Umalis po siya para hanapin nga po kung ano talaga yung passion niya. And napunta po siya sa politics, pero nakita niya po na pangit ang politics talaga sa Philippines. Charot! Tapos po, naisip niya na mas nakikita niya na magiging parang successful siya or ano. Hindi po ay Verlaine. Sa pagsusulat po ng poetry, ng symbolism poetry. Grabe kayo, guys. So, yun po. Nagsulat din po si Rimbaud ng poetry together with Verlaine, and he openly acknowledged a homosexual relationship kay Verlaine. Kasi syempre di pa tapos ang chika natin. Ay kinumpit ang age. Hindi pa po tapos ang chika natin. Noon po kasing nagkaroon ng LQ, yung dalawa, binaril po. Hala, hindi po, grabe. Binaril po ni Rimbaud si Verlaine. Ay, baliktad. Binaril po ni Verlaine si Rimbaud sa Riz. And yun po, kaya hindi na nakapagsulat si Rimbaud. Pero, kahit po ganon ang nangyari, one of the most famous writer pa rin po ng symbolist movement, si Rimbaud, and marami po siyang na-publish na nagkaroon po. Huwag niya na pong i-chismis yan. Sabi ko, magpo-focus tayo sa poetry, hindi sa chika. Ayun po, marami pa rin po siyang naisulat tulad ng A Season in Hell. Huwag niyong uli distract, guys. Less Illuminations po and such. Ayun po, pwede niyo pong i-search kung gusto niyo pong magbasa ng ilan niyang gawa. And ayun po, doon po natatapos ang sa aking report ko po. Sana nag-enjoy kayo. Ayun po, let's move to the Harlem Renaissance po, to be reported by Miss Melanie Alvarado. Sana hindi nyo natandaan yung mga chika, no?
And good afternoon po. So, salamat sa latest, Madam Marites. So, next naman po tayo sa Harlem Renaissance. Next slide po. Ayan. Sino pong pwedeng magbasa? Wala. Okay. So,
Ako na lang po.
sige.
Development of the Harlem neighborhood in New York City as a black cultural mecca in the early 20th century, lasting roughly from the 1910s through the mid-1930s. The period is considered a golden age in African American culture.
Yes, so the Harlem Renaissance was the development of the Harlem neighborhood in the New York City as Black cultural mecca in the early 20th century, and the subsequent social and artistic explosion that resulted. It lasted roughly from the 1910s through the mid-1930s. The period is considered as a golden age in African American culture, manifesting in literature, music, stage performance, and art. Next slide po. Ayan, tapos nagkaroon ng Great Migration. This is since the northern Manhattan neighborhood of Harlem was meant to be an upper class white neighborhood in the 1880s. But rapid overdevelopment led to empty buildings and desperate landlords seeking to fill them. Tapos nung early 1900s, a few black middle-class families from another neighborhood known as Black Bohemia moved to Harlem, and other black families followed. Some white residents initially fought to keep African Americans out of the area, but they failed, so yung mga whites na lang yung umalis. Next slide po. Okay, wait. So, pero before yan, meron pang outside factors na nag-led sa population boom. From the 1910s to 1920, African American population migrated in large numbers from the south to the north, with prominent figures like W.E.B. Du Bois. Yan yung nag-led sa Great Migration. So, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote extensively and was the best-known spokesperson for African American rights during the first half of the 20th century. Du Bois co-founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. This a NAACP was established in the 1909 and is America's oldest and largest civil rights organization. It was formed in New York City by white and black activists, partially in response to the ongoing violence against African Americans around the country. Tapos, he also wrote The Souls of Black Folk. Next slide po. So, yan. The Harlem Renaissance brought along a new creative energy for African American literature. This literary cultural movement was to reject the traditional American standards of writing and discover and utilize their own style of writing to signify their cultural identity. So, one of the most influential figures during this time was Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes, his writing considered of poems, plays, essays, and short stories, and more. He often wrote about racial injustice and about the celebration of African American culture and spirituality. To demonstrate this new style of writing, his first book of poetry published was entitled The Weary Blues. These poems were written using a mix of jazz and blues with traditional verse. Next is Zora Neale Hurston. So another dignity during the Harlem Renaissance was Zora Neale Hurston. She was the author of the great she was the author of the great American novel Their Eyes Were Watching God and received much controversy from it during her time. The critics said that her writing was too black and did not appeal to the white readers because she used a Southern black dialect when writing her book. Some of the major themes delineated in this book were the misery of black people in America, the black autonomy, and the separation between light skinned and dark skinned African Americans. Last is County Cullen. Cullen's most popular poem written during this period is Heritage. Uh, from his poetry collection Copper Sun. His writing style was lyrical because he believed that a poem needs to have a meter in order for readers to understand the poem. In his poem Heritage, he tries to relate his faith to his racial identity. He uses beautiful descriptions of nature to delineate what he is feeling. He essentially denies any connection to his African homeland, which today is recognized as internalized racism. Next slide po. So, syempre, like any period, nag-end din yung Harlem Renaissance. The end of Harlem's creative boom began with the stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression. It wavered until Prohibition ended in 1933, which meant the white patrons no longer sought out the illegal alcohol in the uptown clubs. Tapos in the 1935, the Harlem residents had moved on to seek work. They were replaced by the continuous flow of refugees from the south, many requiring public assistance. And then there is also a race riot of 1935. It broke out following the arrest of a young shoplifter, resulting in 3 dead, hundreds injured, and millions of dollars in property damage. The riot was the death knell for the Harlem Renaissance. Next slide po. Ayan. The impact of Harlem Renaissance is that artists it gave these artists pride in control over how the black experience was represented in American culture and set the stage for the civil rights movement. So for the next movement po, beat movement, next slide po. Yan. The next movement is the beats or the beat movement. Next po. Ako na lang po yung magbabasa. So the Beat movement, or also called Beat Generation, the American social and literary movement originating in the 1950s and centered in the bohemian artist communities of North Beach, Los Angeles, San Francisco's North Beach, Los Angeles, Venice West, and New York City's Greenwich Village. It adherent self-styled as beat, originally meaning weary, but later also connoting a musical sense of beatific spirituality and other meanings. And derisively called beatniks expressed their alienation from conventional or square society by adopting a style of dress, manners, and hip vocabulary borrowed from jazz musicians. They advocated personal release, purification, and illumination through the heightened sensory awareness that might be induced by drugs, sex, or the disciplines of Zen Buddhism. The Beats and their advocates found the joylessness and purposelessness of modern society sufficient justification for both withdrawal and protest. Next. Next slide po. Ayan. Tapos, the beat poets transform the poetry into an expression of genuine live experience. They read their work and sometimes to the accompaniment of progressive jazz in such beat strongholds. Yan, in the bookstores in San Francisco. The verse was frequently chaotic and liberally sprinkled with obscenities and frank references to sex, all intended to liberate poetry from academic preciosity. Tapos there are two most representative uh, there are two people na like sila talaga yung nag-represent ganon. Tapos si Allen Ginsberg, Hall, it became the most representative poetic expression of the beat movement. The poem itself embodied the essence of the beat's voice. Its first performance in 1955 was a disorderly celebration, and the obscenity trial in 1957 that followed its publication showed the movement social and political relevance. Uh, Next is Jack Kerouac. He is a novelist. He advocated a kind of free, unstructured composition in which the writer put down his thoughts and feelings without plan or revision in order to convey the immediacy of experience. Next slide po. Ayan. So by about 1960, the beat movement as a fad had begun to fade. Though its experiments with form and its social engagement continued and had lasting effects. So the movement produced a number of significant writers. First one is Gregory Corso. Gregory Corso, or Gregory Nuncio Corso, he is an American poet, a leading member in the mid 1950s of the Beat movement. All of Corso's poems, those in Gasoline, are the most typical, using the rhythmic incantatory style effective in spoken verse. And next is Philip Wallen, or Philip Glenn Wallen. He is also an American poet who emerged from the beat movement of the mid 20th century, known for his wry and innovative poetry. His poetry of the 1960s culminated in Everyday and On Bear's Hand, both of which include thoughtful observation of everyday life. Next is Gary Snyder. His full name is Gary Sherman Snyder. He is an American poet, early identified with the beat movement, and from the late 1960s, an important spokesman from the concerns of communal living and ecological activism. Snyder received the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry in the 1975. Snyder's poetry draws on the mythic and religious experience of his own daily life in his verse. His free verse style exhibits a variety of influences from Walt Whitman to Ezra Pound to Japanese haiku. Prominent in his first two books of poems, Riprap and Myths and Texts, are images and experiences drawn from his work as logger and ranger in the U.S. Pacific Northwest. And lastly is Leroy Jones. Madami siyang pangalan. Amiri Baraka, or also called Imamu Amiri Baraka, original name Everett Leroy Jones, called Leroy Jones. Leroy later changed to Leroy. He is an American poet and playwright who published provocative works that assiduously presented the experiences and suppressed anger of Black Americans in a white dominated society. His first significant play, Dutchman, in 1964 and became a film in 1967, which recounted an explosive confrontation on a train between a black intellectual and a white woman who murders him. Won the 1964 Obie Award for the Best Off-Broadway American Play. Next po. Ayan. The Beat movement paved the way for broader acceptance of the unorthodox and previously ignored writers such as the Black Mountain poets and the novelist William S. Burroughs. Uh, Yun po for the next period po to be presented by Clifford po yata.
Ay, ma'am, excuse me po, wala po kasi si Joyce Alvis. Kaya po, laktawan muna po namin yung part niya. Okay lang po ba?
Okay, sige.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you po. Si Clifford Andrada na po. Thank you po.
Good afternoon po. Ma'am, naririnig po ako.
Yes po.
As pakilipat dun sa Black Arts movement. Sa pinakadulo na. Yan. Black Arts movement. Next slide. Who wants to read? Miss Annalyn Manyo.
The Black Arts Movement. The Black Arts Movement was the name given to a group of politically motivated Black poets, artists, dramatists, musicians, and writers who emerged in the wake of the Black Power movement. And the poet Amiri Baraka is widely considered to be the father of the Black Artist movement, which began in 1965.
Thank you. So Black Arts is the aesthetic and spiritual sister of the Black Power concept. Because the Black Arts and the Black Power concept are both related to the Afro-Americans' desire for self-determination and nationhood. So alam naman natin na yung kaya nga Black, tumutukoy yun sa mga Black people. So, alam naman natin na since then up to this time, yung mga Black nakaka-experience sila ng discrimination, violence. So nabuo itong yung Black Arts movement dahil dun sa na yon, sa problema ng society na yon, yung discrimination, violence against Black people. So who is Amiri Baraka? So Amiri Baraka was the founder of by the way, this Black Arts movement started in 1965. Sa iba namang source, nagsimula daw siya mid-1960. Mas naglast lang to ng for about a decade lang. So It started in 1965 when poet Amiri Barako, or also known as Leroy Jones, yung kanina inano ni ni Miss Melanie, established the Black Arts Repertory Theater in Harlem, New York as a place for artistic expression. Amiri Baraka was the founder of the Black Arts Movement. He was known for his play, Dutchman, yung kaninang nabanggit ni Melanie. This play presents a stylized encounter that illustrates between blacks and whites in America, as well as the political and psychological conflicts facing the black Americans men during the 1960s. So Amiri Baraka was also known for his uh, aggressive style. So his writing is controversial, has often polarized readers. Just like his work, Somebody Blew Up America. So yung ano na to, yung work na ni Amiri Baraka, Somebody Blew Up America, na ano siya, na labeled and accused siya as anti-Semite. So ano nga ba yung anti-Semite? Yung anti-Semite kasi yung ano, parang disgrace mo yung ano, yung mga Jews, yung karapatan ng mga Jews. Na-labeled siya as anti-Semite dahil dun sa work niyang Somebody Blew Up, kasi nga yung style niya very aggressive niya. So next slide please. So pumunta naman tayo dun sa ano, sa mga poets. Okay, basa. Please. Please read. Maricar Manyo.
Important poets in the Black Arts Movement were Sonia Sanchez, Jane Cortez, Etheridge Knight, Haki R. Madhubuti, Caroline M. Rogers, and Nikki Giovanni.
Para hindi na humaba yung ano, iano ko na lang sila kasi these poets, may ano sila, may common ano sila. They have one in common. They wrote because of their desire for civil rights, women empowerment. As a Black American, they also want to be recognized as the same as white. Yun yung ano, parang yung mga works nila pumapatungkol dun sa mga ano, sa civil rights, women's liberation and peace. So how Black Arts Movement end? The Black Arts Movement began to fade in the mid-1970s. Naglast lang nga siya ng mga decade lang. One of the reasons for the end of the Black Arts Movement was a political switch from nationalism. So from nationalism, yung mismong founder ng na si Amiri Baraka, from nationalism nag-switch siya sa Marxism. Alam niyo po ba yung Marxism?
Marxism.
Yes, Mr. Arnel.
Opo. Explain ko ba yung Marxism o tatanong mo lang?
Kahit brief explanation mo lang sa Marxism.
Isa yung literary theory ng Marxism.
Oo.
Siya, yung mga yung Marxist criticism nag-focus siya sa historical background, na historical socio-economics and political background ng isang literary work. So dinidisregard niya yung kontra siya ng formalism eh. Dinidisregard niya yung form, yung structure, yung rhyming scheme, lahat ng mismong literary art na yun. Nagfo-focus siya yung background or yung context nung mismong literary art, na ang sinasabi ng Marxist theory, criticism, merong outside influence, may influence ang politics, history, and capitalism, ganyan, sa mga literary works. Ganun.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Arnel. Yun nga, from nationalism, nag-switch siya sa Marxism, kaya yung Black Arts Movement, iniwan niya na lang ng basta-basta. Kumbaga, wala siyang paninindigan sa sarili niyang legacy, yung Black Arts Movement. So, yun lang. Amiri Baraka had a very complicated legacy because as a writer himself, left the Black Arts Movement and switched as a Marxist-Leninist. Yun lang po, yun sa akin. Ma'am, wala man po yung si Miss Joyce po. Kaya ako na po, supposed to be po ako yung last na magre-report po.
So, that's it for group 1, no?
Yes po, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you, group 1. So ito na yung last reporter for today, no? And yung wala na lang today, yung hindi pa nagre-report. Am I right?
Yes po, ma'am. Si Miss Joyce Alvis daw po.
Alright, we'll just inform Sir Ken. So, do you still have classes after this, or is this your last subject for today?
Last class for today po itong literary criticism, ma'am.
Regine.
Okay, congratulations to all the reporters for today. You all did well. You have explained and emphasized each topic in a very clear manner. Thank you for a very nice presentation. We have seen a different literary movements. No, so that would be all for today. Since Sir Ket said that today's session will be allotted for the group reports. No, Ma'am Ray.
Pero before we leave po, let's have our photo opportunity for today. So, who is assigned to take a screenshot or picture for today? Meron po bang naka-assign?
Ma'am, alam ko po si Daniel Dabo po yung naka-assign po.
Alright, sige. Sino po yung naka-assign for today? You will take a screenshot po as a documentation.
Ako na lang po.
Okay.
On cam na kayo, guys. Tara. Wala na mag-on cam. Mabilis ang punas ng muta, charot. Okay na siguro to na. Okay, 1, 2, 3, smile. Hawaki, 1, 2, 3, go. Thank you, guys. Thank you po, ma'am.
Thank you, Sir Arnel. So, I guess that's it. We'll just inform Sir Kent how our class went for today. So,